Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this week I had an idea with teeth. Of course, like all good toothy brains, this idea starts with a heart. I'll start my heart with a little ball of red clay that I can squish into a vaguely heart-shaped shape into which I can poke a little divot for an eyeball, because of course this heart has an eyeball in the center. Where else would it be? I'll make sure the eyeball is nicely centered in my eyeball divot before building up the eyelids, blending them into the body, and cleaning up the rougher edges. Now, once I've added the eyeball, I can start to refine the shape of the heart, delineating the various atriums and ventricles, remembering of course that this is a heart with an eyeball in the center, so perfect anatomical accuracy isn't top of the list of priorities. Otherwise, once I'm happy with my anatomy, I'll poke a couple divots into the top for some arteries and aorta before adding the ever-important veins and baking my heart in the oven. I'll then drill some holes into those pre-baked valves as well as all over the underside of the heart so I can add lots of little lengths of armature wire, snip those to size, then wrap them in their own lengths of heart-colored clay. After a little texture work, that's pretty much it for the heart and eyeball combo, so it's on to making a brain. I need the brain to be hollow since my heart's going to go inside, so I'll form it out of packing paper wrapped in aluminium foil. Then a quick test to make sure I've got space to fit the heart, and I can slap on some clay. Once I've got my gray matter in place, I'll cut a line down the center of the brain to separate the cerebral hemispheres, then it's into the oven to bake. I can then bisect my smooth brain and remove the stuffing, leaving me with two empty halves of a cerebral coconut shell. However, I still need a hole for the mouth, so I'll tape the sides together and mark out where I want my orifice to be before cutting away the clay. Now that I've got a pretty rough looking monochromatic brain with a hole, I can start the beautifying process by painting the inside of the brain with a thick coat of bacon bond before taking some pre-chewed chewing gum and rolling it into a long, noodly, wormy dealy that can then get wrapped all willy-nilly inside the shell. Now, not a lot of people know this, but double bubble chewing gum was originally called brain matter bubble gum due to the pinkish brain-like hue, and it was sold by doctors since it was purported that chewing it would increase activation in the parietal lobe, thus increasing the intelligence of anyone that chewed it. Unfortunately, after a number of accidents involving overdeveloped infant brains that led to highly evolved psychic children running amok in downtown Philadelphia, they were forced to change the recipe to what we now know as double bubble. If you're interested and you want to learn more, you can always check out the 1999 Oscar-winning documentary Baby Geniuses, though I'd advise caution as it's pretty heavy stuff. Once I've wrapped both the inside and the outside of the brain, I'll add some final wobbly brain-like texturing to my noodly hemisphere as well as fill in any of the more substantial gaps with a little liquid clay before poking some divots for future teeth. To make sure my two brain halves fit together nice and snug, I'll wrap one half in cling film so I can press both sides together firmly. The soft, unbaked clay should press together to fill in the gaps, while the cling film will help keep them from sticking to each other. I'll then separate my brains again and pop them into the oven to bake while I get to work making the spinal column and cerebellum. Despite my brain being hollow, I'm pretty sure it's going to be heavy, so to keep the beast aloft, I'm going to be using the thickest gauge armature wire I have. I'll cut an appropriate length of wire away, leaving plenty of the bottom for mounting. Then I'll wrap the top in a layer of wire that I can then coat in a thick blob of pink, brain-colored clay and blend it into whatever this shape is. Another layer of cling film goes on top so I can press my fully formed brain down onto the clay to create an imprint that I can use to line up the sections later. Using my ball stylus, I'll texture the sides until it looks like a pink walnut. I'll then wrap the shaft in some aluminium foil, then coat that foil in a layer of bone-colored clay. This bone-colored clay will be my brain's spinal column, so once I've smoothed and blended the clay together to remove the seams, I'll add a bit of texture and shape before carving some appropriately sized sections into the spine to create the individual vertebrae. I can then poke some little holes into the sides and back of the columns to add some little lumps that will become the spinous and transverse processes. I'll then blend all this together so it's one solid piece before giving the spinal column some final surface texturing, then tossing it into the oven to lock everything in place. I can then drill some holes into the side of my wrinkly pink gonad to attach some wire that I'll then bend into wobbly tentacles that I can wrap in more pink clay. Finally, some final tentacly texturing will ensure my noodly brain arms are appropriately spooky, and it's back to the brain to finally fit those teeth I mentioned way back before I even started the spinal column. Otherwise, that's the 4 sections of my big floating brain finished and ready for some painting. The brain has a nice pink base coat, but it's lacking in depth, so I'm going to start by giving the whole thing a heavy once over with a deep red. I really only want this to soak into the cracks and crevices to add shading, but I also don't want to spend all day painting each crack and crevice, so instead I'm going to blast the brain with my airbrush and then work my way back up with the original bubblegum pink. I'll liberally apply the first layer of pink with a makeup sponge, which will help to keep the paint from leaking down into the crevices when I inevitably get overzealous in my application. I'll then come back and build up some highlights with several layers of very thin, progressively lighter pinks until I've got a nice contrast between the dark recesses and the fully exposed noodly bits. A bit of alcohol and a cotton bud will help to remove the pink and red layers on the teeth while still leaving a sort of gross gradient towards the brain, and a couple coats of white will clean up the tips. I'll then repaint the heart with a few layers of lighter reds and highlight with pinks before peeling away the eye and the purple aorta covering, the latter of which will get a purple wash while the former gets a white once-over, followed by a big ugly jaundicey yellow iris and a big black pupil in the center. The tentacly cerebellum will get the same red to pink paint scheme as the brain, and once I've removed the overpainting from the spinal column, I'll give the bony bits a heavy weathered bone wash, followed by some lighter bone white highlights because I thought it looked kind of fancy. Once that's cured, I can remove my brainstem from the wood block and bend the wire forwards in such a way that it's able to stand upright and without support. To support it anyways though, I'll mark out where it sits on a little foam base, and using the tip of my hot glue gun, I'll carve a little channel that it can fit into. A little hot glue on the inside of the brain will keep the heart in place, and a little more hot glue will keep my 2 cerebral halves from falling apart when I attach the entire thing to the brain stem. What the hot glue won't help with though is the fact that this brain weighs way more than even this chunky wire can support, which means I need to figure something else out. I'll remove the brain from the foam and replace it with a sturdier strip of MDF and secure the stem in place with more hot glue, then cover the MDF in foam and the foam in another layer of MDF. The MDF will keep the foam from flexing, and I've drilled a little hole in the topmost layer so that I can fit a teeny tiny length of acrylic rod through at an angle. The rod is just strong enough to keep the brain upright, so I'll cut away the excess foam and fill in the empty spots before painting the entire base black. Because the brain is supposed to be flying, but it weighs way too much to be supported in mid-flight, I thought maybe I could make it look like the brain is dragging the spinal column through the dirt, which means I need to make some dirt. I make my dirt with the same basic ingredients: some hole filler, a little Mod Podge, some brown paint, and a bit of actual dirt. This all gets mixed together until I've got a nice sloppy tub of mud that can get slathered over the entire base. To make it look like the spine is dragging through the dirt, I'll push the dirty, muddy mixture up and away from the center of the base in a wave away from the spine. Once the mud's been left overnight to dry, I've got an excellent little dirty ground that'll add some color variation to by aggressively dusting with some pigment powders. I'll then blast the base with a sealant to lock the powders in place before deciding that it's maybe a bit too boring, so I'm gonna add some basing glue with a damp brush that I can sprinkle some static grass over top. Unfortunately, my fingers aren't staticky enough to make the grass stand on end, but because the brain is in the way, there's no way to use my grass applicator. What I can do though is use my vacuum over the grass before the glue's dried to remove the excess as well as lift some of the grass upwards. Finally, I want the brain to be nice and gooey, so I'll give the entire surface a heavy dusting of high gloss varnish. I also realized that my Airbrush Booth wasn't plugged in, which is why there's a big cloud of atomized varnish waiting to be sucked into my lungs. To make the mouth a bit goopier, I'll add a bit of UV resin to the teeth and drape a little length of clear fishing line between them. By adding a bit of UV resin to the line, I can make the teeth look like they're covered in saliva. I'll then repeat this until there's perhaps a bit too much saliva, at which point I'd say we're done here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to my wonderful patrons of Patreon, and a very special hey how are you to my newest patrons, Addison Rex, Mike and Naomi, Lindsay Panita, Andre Pevestorf, Rabtastic Paints, Another Bodak, Rural, Joshua Paul King, Mike and Monty, Lord of All Citrus, Akaru, The Traveler, Exxon, and Mr. Haughty. You are the extra sturdy spinal cord that keeps this toothy, heartfelt brain of a channel aloft. As always, do the things if you want and don't do them if you don't want to. I'm not your mom. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.